Hello everyone and welcome to the next video in the Burst Education series. Today we're going to have a look at types of study design. This is something that a lot of people, and especially clinicians, often get wrong. The design of a study is one of the most important things to consider, both when planning a new research project, as well as when evaluating the results or the report of a previously conducted study. And this is because different study designs are tailored to answer different types of research questions. But also, designs can vary in the resource requirements and the costs of conducting them. Typically, randomized controlled trials are the most expensive and the most labor-intensive types of study design, with other designs generally being cheaper and requiring less resources. And of course, one of the main differences between different types of study design is the risk of bias. Randomization is designed to reduce the risk of bias, whereas non-randomized studies in general will suffer from a higher risk of certain types of bias. Now, types of study design might seem like a complicated subject, but it is actually quite easy to understand if you grasp a few key concepts. The first of these is the difference between experimental and observational studies. If study participants have an intervention assigned to them by the investigating team, and this could be any type of intervention, drugs, surgery, a change in lifestyle, then this is an experimental study. And examples of this include randomized controlled trials, non-randomized comparative studies, or even single-arm case series. On the other hand, if the investigating team does not assign an intervention, and rather just observes what happens to participants over time, then this is an observational study. And examples of these include cohort studies or case control studies. So the key difference between experimental and observational studies is the assigning of an intervention by the investigating team. The next key concept is the difference between prospective and retrospective studies. And this is where a lot of people slip up. I've often been asked the question, if we look back over a series of cases, but we were assessing outcomes from the first case to the last case chronologically, isn't it a prospective study? And the answer is no, and I'll explain why. There are two key things here. First of all, when was the study protocol made? And second of all, when did the outcomes of interest occur? If the protocol was made before the outcomes occurred, then and only then is it a prospective study. And conversely, if the protocol was put together after the outcomes occurred, then it is a retrospective study. This is quite a clear distinction and there shouldn't be any confusion. Another concept to understand is the difference between an analytical and a descriptive study. This is not quite so clear-cut, and often you'll find studies that do both. But essentially, an analytical study attempts to quantify the relationship between factors, whereas a descriptive study simply gives a picture of what is happening in a population in a given time. So let's put some of these concepts into practice. The Center for Evidence-Based Medicine website provides flowcharts which help in deciding the type of study design. This is the flowchart that you come across first, and although useful, I find it's less intuitive to decide whether a study is analytical or descriptive as the first step. So feel free to use this one if you find it works for you, but I actually prefer the next one, which is a flowchart by John Howick, also of the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, which I think is more intuitive for clinicians. So we start by asking the question, did the investigator assign the exposure? Which, as we know, is the difference between an experimental study and an observational study. If the investigators did assign the exposure or the intervention, that makes it an experimental study. The next question to ask is whether this intervention or exposure was randomly allocated. And if so, that makes it a randomized controlled trial. If not, then it makes it a non-randomized trial. Of course, randomized trials can be further divided into different types, such as crossover studies, etc., but we won't go into that. If the investigators did not assign the exposure, that makes it an observational study. And in that case, the next question for us to ask is whether there was a comparison group or not. If there was a comparison group, it makes it an analytical study, because it means we were trying to establish the relationship between two factors. If there was no comparison group, that makes it a descriptive study, and examples of these include qualitative studies and surveys. Analytical studies, on the other hand, include cohort studies, case control studies, and cross-sectional studies. And the difference between these is simply based on whether we are following the participant from the time of exposure or intervention to the time when the outcome of interest occurs, as is the case in a cohort study, or whether the outcome has already occurred and we are going back to evaluate what exposures have happened, which would make it a case control study, or whether we are just doing a cross-sectional study to assess the relationship between exposures and outcomes at a given point in time. So to quickly recap, 3 main questions should be able to let you evaluate what type of study design has been utilized. And these 3 questions are whether the investigator or the investigating team assigned the exposures or interventions. Number 2, was the study protocol created before the outcomes of interest occurred? And number 3, what was the time relationship between the exposure or intervention and the outcome? So that's a whistle-stop tour of the types of study design. I hope that's provided some clarity, but to really nail it down, I'd suggest working through the flowchart yourself with a few studies you've come across, and soon the concepts will become second nature. Don't forget to have a look at our website for the latest news and updates on ongoing collaborative projects, and any questions, feel free to fire them across. Thanks for watching.